Right, this is Access Reality. I'm Ali Kadili. I have today Dr. Scott Solomon, who's an associate teaching professor in biosciences at Rice University. Dr. Solomon's main interests are evolutionary biology, ecology, and entomology. His book is entitled Future Humans Inside the Science of Our Continuing Evolution, and gave a very interesting TED Talk, I think 2 or 3 years ago, that was entitled Evolutionary Biology on Mars. So welcome, Dr. Solomon. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. So these days, there's lots of talk about going to Mars, how to do it, the technology, the timelines, what we're going to do when we're going to get there, and some debate as to whether or not we should even go there or focus our efforts on Earth. Assuming we do get there and there's humans living there long-term, generation after generation, as you know, the gravity on Mars is less than 40% of that on Earth, which is the gravity that our bodies have evolved to thrive in. So what would the effects long-term be of that on the people that go there now and then on the generations that are born there later on?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really interesting question, right? And one of my areas of focus in the recent past has been trying to answer questions like that. So as you pointed out, there would be some effects on the people who are the first to travel from Earth to Mars. And we know a fair bit about how space flight affects the human body by studying astronauts and cosmonauts that have spent time aboard the International Space Station, and before that in the Space Shuttle and other programs. So we can get some insight into what the likely impact on those people would be for being in lower gravity. Although, as you point out, it's not a microgravity environment as astronauts experience on the International Space Station, but about a roughly 1/3 of the gravity of Earth on Mars. So in general, we know that having lower gravity causes a lot of changes to the human body. And they have to do with things like the muscles and the bones, which become weaker without having to work against the force of gravity. Astronauts try to counteract that by doing a lot of exercise while they're in orbit. So it's possible to minimize some of that bone and muscle atrophy and bone density loss through exercise. But nevertheless, astronauts still return to Earth with weaker bones and muscles than when they began their expedition. And that's typically for experiences that range from half a year to at most about a year. For people going to Mars, just the journey there is going to take about that long. And so if they spend any time on Mars, and that means that they're going to be subjecting their bodies to a much longer exposure to that lower gravity environment. But I think the question that you raised about multiple generations is an even more fascinating one, in my opinion. What we suspect would happen is that babies that were born on Mars would have even more substantial changes to their muscles and their bones, because of course our bodies grow in response to the environment that we are presented with. And we know that early childhood is a really important time for the growth of muscles and bones. The reality is there isn't research that looks specifically at that question, so we have to try to extrapolate from what we know about adults. But it's quite likely that later generations of people living on Mars would really have substantial changes to their bones and their muscles.
Would it be fair to say that they'll be much weaker than us living here on Earth?
Well, that's a good question. It depends on what you mean by much weaker, right? So weaker in the environment that they're living in on Mars? Not necessarily. It could be that the body responds so that they're able to perform functions on Mars perfectly fine, but that if, for example, they tried to return back to Earth, that they would find that to be difficult, if not impossible, because if the bones are growing in such a way that they are able to withstand that, roughly 1/3 gravity or 3/8 gravity on Mars, their bodies might not be able to sustain to withstand the forces that would be imposed on them by a full 1G on Earth. Their bones might simply be too weak. And that doesn't even take into account the forces that astronauts experience on entering the Earth's atmosphere. So to get from Mars to Earth, you'd have to travel, and that involves the high G forces that astronauts experience when they re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. So it might become very difficult, if not impossible, for people who were born on Mars to come back to Earth.
So what you're saying is that ultimately they will have appropriate strength for the environment there, but that's too weak to live on Earth for Earth's conditions. It kind of reminds me of that science fiction movie, John Carter, whereby he goes there and now he has like superhuman strength because there's lower gravity on Mars, so he can jump, like almost fly.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, there's sort of two parts to it. One is, how does the body respond within an individual's lifetime to the local environment? And I think, yeah, you'd see most likely the body responding in ways that are typical of what we see on Earth, in terms of, if you do a lot of resistance exercises, you get stronger bones and muscles. If you do less, then your bones and muscles are weaker. But the other aspect of it is evolutionary change over generations. And that's kind of been my focus, is to try to consider how natural selection and other evolutionary forces might tweak the body in ways that go beyond just how it reacts. In other words, there could be evolutionary forces at play that might take the body in unexpected directions. One example of that is if we think about the forces that the body experiences during childbirth. Those types of forces would potentially make it very dangerous for women to give birth on Mars, because their skeletons, having been weakened by the lower force of gravity on Mars, might not be able to withstand the forces imposed on them during childbirth. And if that's the case, then you get into a situation where women might be risking their lives and the lives of their babies by giving birth. So it's possible that natural selection would favor people who start off life with denser bones that would allow them to lose some of that bone density as they age, so that by the time they reach childbearing years, they would be more likely to survive childbirth and therefore more likely to have a healthy baby.
Any other effects other than on the musculoskeletal system from living chronically in a low gravity situation, the way our physiology and the blood flows? It's all used to a gravity of this magnitude. Any other effects that we know about?
Yeah, we do know about some other effects, and they have to do with the redistribution of blood and other fluids throughout the body. So astronauts often experience this feeling that their heads sort of feel swollen and puffy, and there's a lot of pressure. And that's because the flow of blood and other fluids normally on Earth is pushed downwards towards the lower part of the body as part of the way that gravity acts on the body. And that blood is basically redistributed equally throughout the body in a lower gravity environment. Now, on a 3/8 gravity environment on Mars, it would be something in between those two. How that would affect survival and reproduction is a bit unclear. I don't know that there would be evolutionary changes to the way that that those fluids operate, but the heart would not have to be working quite as hard to distribute blood throughout the body. So it is possible that the heart could evolve to become, in effect, weaker, because basically it wouldn't need to be quite as strong to push blood throughout the body in that environment. But the other thing that we see is changes to the eyes and to vision. And this is actually something that is a little bit less well understood. Astronauts often experience some vision problems during their time in space flight, and those can lead to actually permanent changes or chronic changes to their vision, even upon return to Earth. We don't yet fully understand the physiology of what's going on there. It may have to do with changes in the amount of pressure that the eye experiences because of the change in gravity. So it is possible that that our eyes and that vision would be affected by living on Mars for a prolonged period of time. But it's something we really need to better understand before we can predict how that would change.
I mean, my guess would be that there would be effects that we didn't even anticipate, that we don't really think of as being affected by gravity. But another
Yeah.
issue is radiation, because as you know, Mars's atmosphere is less than 1% of that of Earth's, so can't really protect from radiation. Doesn't have a magnetosphere either. Now, um, they're talking about people living in either enclosed places like glass domes, so to speak, or underground, which would shield from some of the radiation, but there would still be radiation, more radiation compared to here. What would the effects of that be on generations, on the individuals that are there, the first generation versus the ongoing evolution?
I think this is a really important factor, and you're absolutely right that radiation hits the surface of Mars at nearly full strength because of the thinner atmosphere and the total lack of magnetosphere, both of which protect us here on Earth from space radiation. So I think the short-term effects on the first generation of people living there would be increased rates of cancer, right? Because we know that radiation exposure can lead to cancer. And basically what's happening is that radiation damages DNA. And when the body tries to repair that DNA, it doesn't always do that perfectly. And if it does it imperfectly, it can lead to a mutation, a change in the DNA code, those A's, T's, G's, and C's that make up our genome. And when you have a mutation like that, it can lead to cancer. And so cancer rates are likely to be much, much higher. That is obviously going to be a big health concern. It could increase the mortality rate substantially among the first generation of people. In the long run, there could be some interesting evolutionary consequences of having that increased radiation exposure. Those same mutations or similar types of mutations, the fact that there are mutations being caused by radiation exposure, one of the things that means is that there's also the opportunity for helpful mutations, mutations that rather than causing cancer or some sort of a negative consequence, could actually just by chance lead to some sort of a change in our biology or physiology that would actually make us better at dealing with the different environment that we'd be experiencing there, whether it's the lower gravity or simply the effects of radiation. Just as a hypothetical example, if a mutation popped up that made people better at resisting cancer or surviving cancer, you can imagine that would be really beneficial under the circumstances, and that would quickly become much more common in each subsequent generation. So it's actually an increase in the mutation rate is one of the consequences, and that is fascinating because what that suggests is that it could actually speed up the rate at which evolution occurs, because the rate at which evolution occurs is really controlled by two factors. It's the rate of new mutations that enter the gene pool and how advantageous any of those mutations happens to be in the environment.
Now, this is a super interesting point. Do you not think that the rate of mutations realistically would be too slow to actually change the species, so to speak, given the small number of people, even if it was 1 million on Mars? And the other issue being that, normally when we talk about evolution, these processes of these natural selection would mean that a mutation gives you an advantage so that you live, whereas the other people who don't have it die. You live and reproduce. Whereas an environment like that on Mars, unless somebody gets cancer and dies from that, the rest, even though they don't have the advantageous mutation, we would still make sure they live.
Yeah, so you're bringing up some important points about how evolution operates in humans living today and people today, and so actually this was the topic of my book, which you mentioned earlier, Future Humans. And what I do in that book is to basically look at the various ways in which natural selection and other mechanisms of evolution have continued operating in humans up until modern times. And then I try to project into the future to consider some of the ways, including space colonization, that our evolution could change in the future. And yeah, you're right that we sort of tweak natural selection today by having some ability to control who lives and dies, and how much each of us reproduces. But we don't have complete control. There still are aspects of who lives and who dies, and who reproduces and who doesn't, that are essentially out of our control. And it seems likely that in such a radically different environment like Mars, we would have even less control over those factors than we do here on Earth. So I think it's certainly the case that we would continue evolving. Natural selection would continue to play a factor. And the basic sort of facts of how evolution operates suggest that if you have an increased mutation rate, that will at least create the possibility for faster evolution. I mean, basically, natural selection has to have two things, right? You have to have an advantage for one trait over another trait, and you have to have variation in that trait in the first place. And ultimately, that variation comes from mutation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you could think of a mutation that protects someone from infertility due to radiation, and that person would reproduce more.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, assuming that natural selection gets its way, and that's how things evolve, would the tendency be for humans generally to get darker?
Well, that's an interesting question, because we do know that the pigment in our skin called eumelanin, which is the pigment that affects how light or dark our skin is. What that pigment does in large part is to provide natural protection from ultraviolet radiation, which is, sunlight. That's what causes us to get, a tan, or to have a sunburn. And so ultimately, having more melanin in the skin provides some natural protection from ultraviolet radiation. And so because of that protection, it is possible that people with darker skin would have some sort of an advantage over people with lighter skin in that high radiation environment, and might be more likely to survive and pass on their genes. So you could see natural selection favoring people with more melanin in their skin, with darker skin in later generations. It's also possible we could have mutations that could lead to new ways to protecting us from radiation, perhaps through the evolution of new types of pigments. We actually see this here on Earth, and there's some examples of organisms using pigments like carotenoids, which are the pigments that give carrots their orange color, which can provide some protection from radiation. So it's possible that not only could people develop darker skin to protect from radiation on Mars, but even new skin colors as a way of providing some protection from radiation.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see on Earth here that generally speaking, African populations, but also Asian ones, are also protected relatively from skin cancers. And even though those two colors are very different.
Right. So it's actually quite interesting. There's been some fascinating studies on how skin pigmentation varies across human populations, and how it corresponds to the amount of ultraviolet radiation hitting the surface of the Earth. There's actually quite a strong correlation between how much radiation hits the Earth and how much melanin is in people's skin, in a way that suggests that our skin evolved as we spread across the Earth to protect people that were living in areas that had higher radiation, like closer to the equator, and also higher elevation, both of which are places where the sunlight hits the Earth with more intensity. And in those places, it was advantageous to evolve more eumelanin in the skin. But at the same time, we see in places with very little UV radiation, like the Arctic, for example, very high latitude populations, tended to evolve lighter skin, because in those places it's actually detrimental, it's actually harmful to have too much melanin in the skin, because of course we need to have some amount of sunlight for our bodies to be able to make vitamin D. You go out in the sun and you get just a little bit of sun exposure and you get your vitamin D. If that melanin is blocking the sunlight, that makes it harder for the body to actually synthesize vitamin D. And that can lead to issues like not being able to absorb calcium and make a strong skeleton. So things like rickets can develop when people don't have adequate amounts of vitamin D.
Which is extra important when your bones are not doing well because of low gravity.
Exactly. So having sort of appropriate levels of eumelanin in the skin is something that we know has been important in our evolutionary past. Now, today, that's something that we can regulate a bit more because, of course, we have sunscreen to help protect us from the sun, and we can take vitamin D as a supplement if we're not getting enough of it from the sun or from our diets. And so it's possible that, you know, in a colony, say on Mars, that we would be able to deal with the vitamin D issue through our diets. But nevertheless, it does seem possible that skin pigmentation could evolve in a way that would help with protection from radiation.
All right. And now going to a different planet kind of raises all sorts of issues. Some of them are ethical, and some of them intersect with genetics. And I think that a lot of people had argued that it's in our best interest to have a wide variety of genes in the pool of people that ultimately end up in Mars. And I think you had mentioned in one of your talks that you'd recommend that the majority be from Africa because of the increased variety, increased genetic variety in Africa. Is that correct?
So the idea is that you're right, that having more variation is very beneficial for a number of reasons. One is that having more variation simply is a better representation of all of humanity. So if the goal is to sort of have almost like an arc in the sky, right? A way of sort of ensuring the long-term survival of humanity in case there was some disaster here on Earth, which is one of the main motivations for colonizing other planets, then of course it would make sense to try to have all human populations represented to the extent that we can. But from a genetic perspective, having genetic variation is like a hedge against uncertainty in the future, because as I was saying earlier, the more variation you have, the more ability a population has to evolve in response to changing conditions in the future. So to be able to better adapt genetically and biologically to conditions on another planet as they are now or as they will be in the future, it is beneficial to have as much genetic variation as possible. So if you look at the distribution of genetic diversity across humans on Earth, what we see is actually, interestingly, we don't even have that much genetic variation compared to what we see in other species. Even compared to our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees, humans have much less genetic diversity than what we see in chimpanzees. But the majority...
It's fascinating because I think most people would agree that humans look different. There's more variation in how they look to us versus all chimpanzees kind of look the same to us. Or is that because we're humans?
Yeah, some of that might be that the chimpanzees look similar to us because we're not very good at differentiating among the differences that are important to chimpanzees, whereas we tend to be acutely aware of whatever tiny differences exist among different humans, at least in outward physical appearance. But yeah, I mean, it is remarkable because chimpanzees, there aren't that many of them. They're they're endangered, and yet despite their small size, there's more difference from one chimpanzee to another than you see from one human to another. And the reason for that has to do with our population histories. So for chimpanzees, up until recently, there were a lot of them, and thanks mostly to us, their population sizes have drastically reduced in the recent past. Whereas for humans, it's the opposite. Up until very recently, there were not that many of us. And of course, our population has exploded in size in just the last few hundred years. So basically, our genetic diversity hasn't yet caught up with our actual population size. But yeah, if you look at where the genetic diversity is distributed to the extent that it exists, the greatest amount of genetic diversity in humans exists in the continent of Africa and in populations that are recently descended from Africa. And the reason for that is because that's where our species evolved. That's where we first came into existence. And it was, between 200 and 300,000 years ago that Homo sapiens first came into existence. And only about 70,000 years ago or so that any Homo sapiens left Africa. They left over land going into the Middle East and then spread into Europe and Asia and eventually made their way to Australia and North and South America. As we expanded across the earth, it was small bands of individuals that were the pioneers. And that meant that only a small number of genes would make it into each of those populations. So genetic diversity decreases as you move away from Africa. And that means that the greatest diversity today can be found in Africa. So if we wanted to just maximize genetic diversity and we could only take a small number of individuals, the best bet would be to draw as many of those individuals as possible from Africa.
Very interesting. But how about if you had a group that consisted of people from Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, that group, wouldn't that have more genetic diversity than a group that is just from Africa?
Well, there's actually more diversity within Africa than there is in the rest of the world combined. So that's why I was saying, if you just wanted to maximize diversity, you'd be good if you sort of drew from African populations. But of course, in reality, we're going to want to be maximizing more than just genetic diversity. We're going to be wanting to have cultural diversity represented. We're going to want to have different skills and abilities represented. You're going to want to have people, as we do with astronauts, who are very highly trained and have certain not just physical but also mental attributes. And so I would imagine we would ideally like to have a global selection in which we take the people who not only represent humanity but also are most likely to succeed in a mission to Mars and in establishing a colony. And there's a lot of different factors that you might want to take into consideration in order to do that. So, for this to be successful, though, you really don't want to have a small number of individuals. You really need to have a fairly large population in order to maximize the chances of success and to increase genetic diversity. So I would, if I were, doing the selection here, I would say we need, to have a population of at least a few 100,000 individuals, if not 1 million, and you want to maximize genetic diversity as well as all of those other factors.
Great. Now, you're a biologist, which means you've spent a great deal of your career thinking and studying and teaching about animals. And you've also thought about Mars and the conditions on Mars. What would an animal evolved perfectly to live on Mars today look like? What would that be? What would be the characteristics of that animal?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, as you mentioned, most of my research is not actually on humans. I've written quite a bit about humans and human evolution, but my research background and area of expertise is actually on ants. So I spent a lot of my career studying ants in different parts of the world and understanding their biology and their evolution. And actually, I may be biased because that's what I spend a lot of time thinking about, but I think ants are actually an interesting model for thinking about how to build a civilization on Mars. For one thing, we were talking about the radiation exposure on the surface. And so a lot of the models for how we would actually build habitats on Mars involve going underground, because going underground provides natural shielding from radiation. So how do you build a society underground? Well, that's something ants have been doing pretty well for about 100 million years. So I think we might be able to look at the architecture of ant nests and examples of ants like leafcutter ants that actually engage in agriculture. So leafcutter ants grow a crop underground. The crop is a type of fungus, and that's their food. And so when they're cutting leaves, they're bringing those leaves underground to feed it to a fungus, which ultimately will be their food. So they've figured out ways to not only keep all of their individuals underground, but also to raise crops underground, and crops that don't depend on sunlight like most of our crops do. So that might be an interesting model to look at for how you not only design a structure, but how you even carry out agriculture in an environment where you're better off being underground.
Now, I know this is not your area of expertise, but have you come across anything talking about the suitability of the soil on Mars to growing anything, assuming that the radiation and the atmosphere are not issues?
Yeah, so there are some studies that have tried to use simulated Martian regolith, as the soil there is called, to try to grow crops. And so the biggest concern, as far as I'm aware, is that Mars regolith has high levels of perchlorate, and perchlorate is something that is typically toxic to plants and to humans. And so that is one of the big concerns about whether it's really even going to be feasible to grow crops in this regolith that contains this perchlorate. And it's, as far as I'm aware, still an unsolved problem. I think it's something that we would need to be able to sort out before any long-term plans can be carried out, because of course you have to have a way to grow your own food. There's no way to sustain a society on another planet if the food can't be grown there. So, you know, growing crops in that type of regolith, that's something that we need to look at. But also figuring out how to have livestock if we're going to have any sort of, animal protein in our diet. We need to figure out what that is going to look like. Usually all of our livestock depends on the ability of those animals to eat plants of some sort, whether it's, you know, cattle grazing on grass, or whether it's grain that we're feeding to, chickens or other sources of animal livestock. One interesting possibility on Mars is the idea of, rather than bringing birds and mammals, which are large, take up a lot of space, need a lot of water, and are also potential sources of disease, it might be better to bring insects as animal livestock, which, you know, the idea of eating insects isn't something that all people are comfortable with, although actually many cultures routinely use insects as a source of animal protein. Insects are really have a lot of desirable qualities when it comes to a source of food, because not only are they healthy and nutritious, but they require a lot less space and a lot fewer resources like water in order to maintain them. And as an added benefit, it's very unusual for diseases to switch from an insect host to a human host, but that happens a lot with birds and mammals.
Are they as susceptible to radiation?
Yeah, all living things are susceptible to radiation. So the types of evolutionary changes that I was talking about that could happen with humans could also happen to our livestock, to our crops, and also to the microorganisms that we bring with us, whether it's wittingly or unwittingly. And all of those things are going to be evolving rapidly, just in the same way that we will be, except that with shorter generation times, they evolve even faster. So yeah, so they're going to be going through these rapid evolutionary changes as well. Something we'll have to pay attention to.
Interesting, because we know, like, here on Earth, as if the reptilian life forms have less genetic diversity. Evolution seems to be a lot slower in them compared to mammals. Is that true?
Well, I'm not sure that it's slower. What you might be referring to is the idea that you can see forms that exist today that are very reminiscent and very similar to forms that existed in the past. So for example, you know, alligators and crocodiles today look a lot like alligators and crocodiles did in the Jurassic period. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the rate of change of evolution is slower. We actually see rapid evolution even in some species of fish and some species of lizards. There's some really famous studies of lizards in the Caribbean where we see very rapid evolutionary change happening across the different islands of the Caribbean. Actually, the rate of change is just different for every species on Earth, and it has to do with those factors we talked about earlier, the rate of mutation and how much of an advantage there happens to be in the particular environment they find themselves in.
Oh, so the idea that reptiles have much more genetic stability, so to speak, than mammals is just a myth?
Yeah, I don't think there's much truth to that, to be honest. I'd have to see some sources to see who's claiming that, but not true as far as I'm aware.
Okay, great. Now, there's lots of talk about, and you just mentioned this, about introducing germs or microbial organisms to Mars from us. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, what we know is that we can't live without microbes. I mean, we used to think of all microorganisms as germs and things that we need to be, killing in order to keep ourselves safe and healthy. But today, it's becoming very clear that that we live in a microbial world, and that our health and well-being is ultimately tied to the microorganisms that are both in and on our body and also in the environment. What we don't yet know is which microbes we have to have in and on our bodies, and which are ones that are sort of just along for the ride and we could live just fine without them. So this is something that we really need to be better informed about before we could do any sort of meaningful, intentional movement of microbes to Mars or other planets, right? I mean, we don't want to leave Earth without the microbes that we know we need in order to survive. But luckily, this is a very active area of research right now.
So on balance, would you say that we shouldn't really be worrying as much about us introducing microbes into a new environment? That it's just
Well,
part of what we are.
so what you might be thinking about here is there is concern about if we want to discover whether life already exists on Mars. There's a lot of concern about whether we might detect a life form on Mars before we arrive there that actually isn't native to Mars, but is something that we brought with our rovers, our probes, our machines that we've sent there. So there is concern about contaminating a quote unquote pristine planet, pristine environment with microbes from Earth. And that is something that we need to be aware of, because of course the discovery of microbes that are indigenous to Mars would be one of the greatest scientific discoveries in history. I mean, as of right now, we don't know whether life exists anywhere outside of planet Earth. And we would very much like to know if it does, for a lot of reasons. In order for us to be able to determine with any certainty that anything we find on Mars or elsewhere is native there, we need to be very careful about not accidentally introducing things.
Yeah. Now, as you alluded to, the active area of research is in the microbiome, which is all the bacterium genetic material, which is massive, that one human body carries. And there's lots of evidence in medicine that variation in that will reflect in disease. So presumably that will change through exposure to radiation, either from the trip or from being on Mars. And so the effects on health would really be unpredictable.
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about how the microbiome would be affected by going to Mars. I mean, for one thing, yes, the radiation will be affecting each of those microorganisms. So those microorganisms have the ability to evolve themselves. But the other thing is that we're the microbes that make up what we call the microbiome, all of the collection of bacteria and other microbes that live in and on our body. That's something that we acquire through the process of birth and early in our childhood. As far as we know, babies in a utero, in their, when they're still within their mothers, they don't actually have a microbiome. So we acquire those microbiomes very early in life. We primarily get our microbes from our mothers, from our fathers, from our siblings, and from other people that we come into contact with. But we can also get some of them from the environment. And on Mars, again, as far as we know, there aren't any microbes in the environment. So we'd only be getting them from one another. And so in other words, we will only have access to the microbes that we bring with us. So that's why, again, it's important to understand what are the microbes that we need to live, healthy lives, and what are the microbes that we could afford to lose without suffering any consequences. So yes, we really need to understand this better and make sure that we don't leave behind any important members of the team, so to speak.
Yeah. Now, we talked about natural selection, and ultimately, let's say that ends up playing a massive role in evolution of the species that remain on Mars. When do they stop being humans? When do they start becoming a different species? Like, what threshold you have to cross to be designated as a new species?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And unfortunately, it's not one that has a simple answer. So there's actually no universal definition that all biologists agree on for what makes a species and how you draw the line between distinct species. One of the most popular definitions has to do with the ability to reproduce. So we would say, you know, two individuals are members of the same species if they can mate and have a baby, right? So if we use that definition, that gives us a fairly straightforward way of sort of drawing the line and saying, okay, people living on Mars, if they evolved to be so different that they wouldn't be able to have a child with someone on Earth, then we would call them a distinct species. It is possible that something like that could happen. There's also definitions of species that involve physical changes. If you look very different, sometimes we'll use that as a way of defining species, or genetic differences. Oftentimes we'll just look at the DNA of species. This is especially true for microbes because, of course, they don't have a lot of outward physical characteristics for us to look at, and they don't reproduce sexually, so you can't apply that definition. So there you're looking at, how much genetic change has there been? That's the definition that is most likely to apply quickly to people living on Mars because of the factors that we talked about earlier. They're likely to undergo a lot of mutations very rapidly because of all the radiation exposure and natural selection. So I actually think that no matter which definition you apply, it is quite possible that we could get what we would consider to be a new species of human evolving in a colony of people living on Mars or elsewhere in the universe.
Yeah, now using the criteria of reproduction, of two members of a different species being able to reproduce, we see that on Earth all the time, right?
We
With
do.
horses and zebras and donkeys and that kind of thing.
Correct.
Yeah. So, but is the criteria then that offspring will also be able to reproduce?
Yes, that's right. When this is a definition known as the biological species concept, and really what it is not just being able to produce a living offspring, but an offspring that is also fertile, meaning that it can go on and reproduce. Not an evolutionary dead end, right? So you want to be able to continue to perpetuate those genes from one generation to the next, and we consider that to be successful reproduction.
Okay. And then going over the genetic material criterion, again, there's no quantitative definitions there, right? In terms of
People try to,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, sometimes it's like a percent of percent difference, but the amount of genetic difference from one lineage to the next really, it varies across different types of organisms. So it's hard to apply an absolute threshold that would be universal across all different forms of life.
Mm-hmm. Great. Now, assuming that the atmosphere and radiation issues on Mars are not a problem, that's a massive assumption, I know. But let's say you had a human population living there. Would they be able to just come and walk around here, and would vice versa?
Well, I think there's a couple of factors there. I mean, one of them is the gravity that we were talking about earlier. So it's possible that people who were born and grew up on Mars simply wouldn't be able to withstand the forces imposed on their bones and muscles by a full 1G that they'd experience on Earth. But the other goes back to microbes. So it's possible that people living on Mars would be living in an environment where there aren't as many infectious diseases, because we, again, would only have the infectious diseases that we would bring with us. And if we don't bring birds and mammals as livestock, like I was talking about earlier, and we only have, maybe a purely vegetarian diet or an insect-based animal protein diet, that minimizes the chances that new infectious diseases would pop up. About 60% of the infectious diseases that we experience here on Earth came about because a microorganism was infecting an animal. It's almost always a bird or a mammal. and it switched hosts and started infecting humans. And this is, this is what happened, of course, in the coronavirus that's causing the COVID-19 pandemic. But we've also seen this in, in HIV, in influenza, and lots of other, Ebola, lots of other examples of infectious diseases that switch hosts. And so without those other animal hosts as reservoirs of disease on Mars, there would be very few infectious diseases that could affect people living on Mars. What that could mean is that the immune system of people living on Mars would be potentially fine as long as you stay on Mars. But if you came back to Earth, that could be a very, very dangerous situation because you'd be exposed to a lot of microorganisms that you might not have any natural resistance to. So this is really reminiscent of what happened to Native Americans when Europeans first arrived and spread smallpox and other diseases that devastated those Native American populations. You might see something similar playing out between people living on Mars and people on Earth.
Yeah, isn't that what the War of the Worlds movie was about at the end? Was that in the
end?
Yeah,
that's the great thing about this is there's been so much science fiction that has explored all of these possibilities. But what's amazing about the era that we're living in now is a lot of that science fiction is becoming or very close to becoming actual science.
Great. And if I just may ask, as a biologist, what got you interested in human evolution in particular on Mars? Because I don't think that's a natural thing for a biologist to be thinking about.
Yeah, it actually goes back to, well, in some ways it goes back to, when I was in college, I took some anthropology courses and became fascinated by human evolution and the study of human evolution. But more recently, it started when I became a university professor at Rice, and I started Rice University in Houston. And I started teaching a course, an introductory biology course, where I was teaching students about evolution. And like any new professor, I wanted my students to be engaged and interested in the material. I wanted them to see how evolution is relevant to their lives. And, I think a lot of people think about evolution as what happened in the past, and often in the very distant past. We think about dinosaurs and fossils, and even in the study of human evolution, we're often thinking about things that happened millions of years ago. But I wanted to make the point that evolution is also a process. It's not just about history. And so I asked my students if they think humans are still evolving, and if so, in what ways. And that got them really talking, and they had a lot of questions and ideas. And so I got interested in that question, and I started looking up, well, what do we know about this? And that's where I discovered that we know a lot, but it's sort of scattered across a lot of different disciplines, a lot of, technical scientific literature from all different fields. So I set out to try to put all of that information together into a single book, which became my book, Future Humans. And it was really only in the very end of that book where, my main goal was to try to make the case that, we can use what we know about the past and what's happening now to make projections that are scientifically informed about the future. And I tried to do that throughout much of the book, but I didn't want to write it without giving some thoughts about our long-term future. And that's where I tried to explore in my final chapter what might ultimately become of our species. And I basically look at three possibilities. One is that we become extinct, which could happen. Another is that we essentially go on indefinitely unchanged, more or less the way we are now. But the third possibility is that we could evolve into a new species. And that's where I started to look at, well, what would it take for us to evolve into a new species? And I look at a couple of different scenarios, and one of them was colonizing space. We know from what happens on Earth, every time individuals colonize an island, say, if a new island pops up in the ocean, some plants or animals arrive there, they often undergo rapid evolutionary change because of the isolation. And that's really very reminiscent of what would happen if humans left the island of planet Earth and moved to another island out in space like Mars.
would you agree that when you look at the evolution of the human species in general, it'll be very different in the past from what it is going forward with technology and the culture and how that's kind of shaping and impacting, playing with the forces of nature, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a big thing that I try to explore in the book is to what extent culture influences our evolution today. I mean, there have been some in the past that have argued that actually, natural selection doesn't even exist anymore, that it's been essentially replaced by culture and cultural evolution. But I try to make a case in the book that we can't really say that natural selection has stopped. It actually is quite clearly still operating. What culture does is it tweaks natural selection. It changes the way that it acts. And so we have much more control today over who survives and who reproduces, but we still don't have complete control. And so that leaves us in a situation where natural selection is still operating. It just operates in a way that's very different from how it operated 100,000 or a million years ago.
Great. And you talked about how your anthropological influences got you to think about evolution on Mars for humans and colonization of space. Did you ever look at or think about other places other than Mars that humans could be at? Titan, some other place?
Yeah, I think the same general principles would apply anywhere. Really, isolation is a major factor in evolution, and any place where the physical environment is different than Earth, which is every place that we know of. Now, there's the possibility that in the even more distant future, we might be able to colonize an exoplanet that is very Earth-like in another solar system. And if that's the case, then perhaps we wouldn't undergo quite as many changes to adapt to the physical conditions, but we still have to get there. And the journey to an exoplanet, which could take generations, could lead to evolutionary changes on the way there. So, the specifics of how we would evolve would, of course, be different depending on what the physical conditions are in each place. But the idea that mutations, natural selection, and isolation are going to influence us would hold true no matter where we go.
So with today's technology, if we found a suitable Earth-like exoplanet, by the time we get there, it's generations. By the time we get there, it's no longer suitable because we've evolved.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of interesting possibilities there. For example, people have talked about putting humans into some sort of cryo storage or something to slow down aging or slow down freezing sperm and eggs in order to try to sort of jumpstart our species once we arrive in such a place. I mean, that technology is far away still, so it's hard to even think through how that would work exactly. I've sort of focused on Mars because it seems to be the consensus for the most likely first step beyond Earth for a long-term human settlement, a long-term human colony. I mean, the moon is another possibility, right? So efforts are already underway, for example, at NASA to create a lunar base. But for the most part, that is, at least for now, likely to be something where people go and stay there for a while, but still return back to Earth. It's so much easier to get from Earth to the moon and back again compared to Mars. And so the closer we are, the less that isolation starts to play a role in our evolution. So, a lunar base might be perhaps not that different from, say, the scientific bases that we have in Antarctica, where people go there for a season or in some cases more, but usually not more than a year at a time. They spend a lot of time there and then they return home, and they might go regularly, but they're not living there. They're not reproducing there. And that is ultimately what matters most for evolution. So all the things we're talking about are changes that would play out if you have a self-sustaining human colony that involves reproduction, babies that are born there and have their own kids over many generations.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Solomon. It was a pleasure talking to you. And thank you.
Thanks so much for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.